The elevator ride up to the penthouse felt like it took forever. The man in the black vest stood quietly in the corner, holding a silver tray filled to the edge with crystal glasses. The champagne inside bubbled gently, but his stomach was churning. He wasn't used to this kind of work anymore. His back ached, and his shoes, which he had polished 3 times before leaving his small apartment, still felt uncomfortable on his feet. When the doors finally slid open with a soft ding, the noise hit him like a wall. It wasn't just loud, it was the sound of money. Laughter, clinking glasses, and the low hum of expensive conversations filled the massive room. The party was already in full swing. The host, a wealthy tech CEO known for being ruthless and arrogant, had rented out the entire top floor of a luxury hotel. There were people everywhere. Men in sharp suits and women in sparkling dresses moved like colorful fish in a giant aquarium of glass and gold. The man stepped out of the elevator and immediately became invisible. That was the first rule of his job: be seen only when you are serving, and disappear the moment after. He moved through the crowd with practiced ease. He had to duck slightly to avoid a waiter carrying a tower of desserts, and he sidestepped a group of men who were shouting about stock prices. He kept his head down, offering drinks with a quiet nod. Most people didn't even look at his face. They just grabbed a glass, maybe gave a distracted grunt, and turned back to their important conversations. He was just part of the furniture to them, a prop in their expensive evening. But then, he saw it. In the far corner of the room, away from the main bar and the dance floor, sat a grand piano. It wasn't just any instrument. Even from across the room, he could tell it was a rare Steinway, black and glossy, reflecting the lights of the city skyline through the floor-to-ceiling windows. It was beautiful. It looked like a sleeping beast waiting to wake up. For a moment, he forgot about the heavy tray in his hands. His eyes locked onto the curves of the wood, the sheen of the ivory keys. It had been years since he had stood this close to an instrument of that caliber. He felt a strange pull in his chest, a mix of longing and sadness. He watched the piano like a hawk. As the night went on, the guests got louder and drunker. The wait staff was running around trying to keep up with the demand for refills. The man noticed a group of young women drifting toward the corner. They were holding martinis and laughing loudly. They wandered over to the piano, not to play it, but because it was a flat surface in a crowded room. The man felt his heart sink. He watched in slow motion as one of the women, wearing a dress that probably cost more than he made in a year, placed her martini glass directly on the polished lid. A red coaster was forgotten in her other hand. The condensation from the cold glass immediately began to beat up on the expensive wood. Then another guest put a phone down. Then a plate of cheese. They were treating a $250,000 instrument like a coffee table. He couldn't just stand there. He didn't care if he got fired. It hurt him to see something so sacred being treated so carelessly. He took a deep breath, adjusted his grip on the tray, and walked toward the corner. He moved with a purpose that was different from his earlier wandering. "Excuse me, miss," he said softly, stepping up to the woman with the martini. "Could I please get you a coaster for that? The moisture might damage the finish." The woman looked up, startled. Her eyes were slightly glazed, and she blinked at him as if she didn't understand what language he was speaking. Then, a man in a sharp blue suit stepped up beside her. This man was younger, with a smug look on his face and a drink in his hand. He looked the server up and down, sneering at the simple black vest and the slightly frayed cuffs of his shirt. "It's fine," the man said dismissively, waving a hand. "It's just wood. It's here for decoration. Don't worry about it." "I know, sir," the older man insisted, his voice staying calm even though his hands were starting to shake. But this is a very delicate instrument. The lacquer is sensitive. I would hate for a ring to stain it. The room went a little quieter around them. People nearby were starting to listen. The younger man saw an opportunity. He loved an audience. He turned to his friends, a wide grin spreading across his face. "Listen to this guy," he laughed loudly. "He's worried about the wood. Hey, buddy, do you even know what this is?" He pointed a finger at the keyboard, which was currently hidden under a napkin. "It looks like a giant dining table to me." A few people chuckled nervously. The older man stood his ground, but he could feel the heat rising in his cheeks. "It is a concert grand piano, sir. It deserves respect." "Respect?" the younger man howled with laughter. "You think this piece of furniture cares about respect? You look like you've never even touched a piano in your life. Look at those hands." He grabbed the server's wrist, raising it up for everyone to see. The hand was rough, calloused from years of hard labor, and the knuckles were swollen. "These are dishwasher hands, not musician hands. You probably think you're Mozart or something, don't you?" The group of young executives burst into laughter. It was a cruel, mocking sound that echoed off the glass walls. The woman with the martini giggled, finally moving her drink, but only so she could take a sip, not because she cared about the wood. "He probably just wants to sit down and rest his feet," she added, earning another round of laughs. The man in the vest pulled his hand back gently. He didn't fight them. He didn't yell. He just lowered his eyes and nodded, a look of resignation settling on his face. He had seen this kind of arrogance before. He knew that in their world, money was the only thing that gave you value. If you weren't rich, you weren't worth listening to. "You're right, sir," he said quietly. "I'm sorry to have bothered you. I'll leave you to it." He turned around and walked back toward the kitchen, the laughter trailing behind him like a dark cloud. He could hear them making more jokes as he walked away, jokes about waiters who think they are artists, jokes about people who don't know their place. He kept his head high, but inside, he felt a heavy weight settle on his shoulders. He walked past the bar, past the CEO who was bragging loudly about his latest success, and found a small shadowy alcove near the service entrance. He leaned against the wall for a moment, catching his breath. He looked down at his hands, the same hands they had laughed at. They were old, yes, and they were tired. But as he flexed his fingers in the dim light, a memory flashed through his mind. He remembered the feeling of those keys, the weight of the chords, the thunder of an applause that was real, not bought. He looked back across the room at the piano. It was still being used as a table. The disrespect hung in the air like a bad smell. He didn't want to be here anymore. He wanted to go home to his quiet apartment and forget this night. But the shift wasn't over. He had 2 more hours. He sighed deeply, adjusted his tie, and picked up a fresh tray of drinks. He had to go back out there. He had to let them laugh, let them look through him. But as he turned back toward the crowd, something in his eyes changed. The sadness was still there, but now there was a spark of something else. A quiet determination. He wasn't just a waiter. And the night was far from over. The clock on the wall ticked past 10, and the energy in the room began to shift. What started as high-energy bragging was slowly turning into boredom. The open bar had been open for hours, and the guests were getting restless. They had eaten the expensive food, they had taken the selfies for social media, and now they needed something to do. The main event of the night was supposed to be a live jazz trio, a famous band from the city that cost a fortune to book. The host had been bragging about them all week. But the stage was empty. The host, a tall man with a temper that matched his expensive suit, was pacing near the entrance. He kept checking his gold watch, then looking at the door. Finally, a frantic event coordinator ran up to him, whispering something in his ear. The host's face turned a shade of red that matched the wine in the glasses. The band wasn't coming. There was some mix-up with their transport, or maybe they just got a better offer. It didn't matter why. The music wasn't happening. The room felt the tension immediately. The hum of conversation died down as people realized the entertainment wasn't arriving. The host hated looking bad in front of his investors and his friends. He needed a plan B, and he needed it fast. His eyes scanned the room, looking for something, anything to save the night. They passed over the waiters, the bar, the ice sculpture. Then, his gaze stopped. He looked right at the corner where the grand piano sat, covered in used napkins and empty glasses. Then, his eyes moved to the man in the black vest who was quietly trying to clean up the mess the guests had made. The host walked over, his movements sharp and aggressive. The crowd parted like the Red Sea, sensing that something was about to happen. The waiter didn't notice the approaching footsteps until a shadow fell over the piano keys. He froze, a half-empty champagne bottle in his hand. When he looked up and saw the host standing there with a strange, twisted smile on his face, his stomach dropped. "Well, well," the host said, his voice loud enough for the people nearby to hear. "We have a bit of a problem with our band tonight. It seems they are lost." The waiter nodded politely, keeping his eyes down. "I am very sorry to hear that, sir. Is there anything else I can get for you while you wait?" "Oh, I don't need a drink," the host said, waving a hand dismissively. "But I remember you from earlier. You were very concerned about this piano, weren't you? You were very worried about the wood." A few of the guests who had been part of the earlier laughing group gathered around. They recognized the waiter and smirked, nudging each other with their elbows. The waiter's throat went dry. "Yes, sir. It is a beautiful instrument. It just needs a little care." The host let out a short, barking laugh. "Care? You seem to know a lot about it. For a waiter, you seem to have a lot of opinions about how things should be done. I'm guessing you play, is that it?" The waiter felt the blood drain from his face. He could feel dozens of eyes locking onto him. He was a cornered animal. He tried to step back, to retreat into the safety of the kitchen, but the piano bench was behind him, blocking his way. I used to, sir," he stammered. "A long time ago. But I am working right now. I really should get back to the bar." "Nonsense!" the host shouted, clapping his hands together. The sound echoed through the room, silencing the chatter on the other side of the penthouse. "The party is dying. We need music. And here we have a man who claims to know all about this instrument. It's perfect." The waiter's heart was hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. "Please, sir. I haven't touched a piano in years. I'm rusty. I wouldn't want to ruin your party." "Rusty?" the host raised an eyebrow, looking around at his guests. "Did you hear that, ladies and gentlemen?" He's shy. "Come on, don't be boring. Sit down. Play us a song. Show us what you've got." The crowd began to chant. "Play. Play. Play." It started as a whisper but grew louder. It wasn't a supportive chant, it was a hungry one. They wanted entertainment. They didn't care if he was good or bad, they just wanted to see a show. They wanted to see the servant put in his place, or perhaps they secretly hoped he would be terrible so they could laugh at him again. The waiter looked at the hostess' face. There was no kindness there, only a cruel excitement. He realized then that he didn't have a choice. If he refused, he would be fired on the spot. He needed this job. He needed the paycheck to pay his rent. He couldn't afford to walk out. Slowly, trembling slightly, he placed the champagne bottle on a nearby table. He wiped his sweating palms on his trousers, leaving dark streaks on the cheap fabric. He turned around and faced the piano. It loomed over him, majestic and terrifying. He reached out and gently moved a stack of dirty napkins off the music stand. The silence in the room was heavy. Every single person was watching him. He sat down on the bench. It was harder than he remembered, and it felt cold through his uniform pants. He looked at the keys. They were slightly sticky from where guests had spilled drinks. It made him sick to his stomach. He flexed his fingers, the joints cracking audibly in the quiet room. "Don't keep us waiting all night," the host taunted from behind him. "Play something lively. Or is chopsticks the only thing you know?" A ripple of laughter went through the crowd. The waiter closed his eyes for a brief second. He blocked out the lights, the chandeliers, the smell of expensive perfume, and the cruel eyes of the rich. He thought about the small apartment he would go back to later. He thought about his life before this, when people clapped for him because they loved the music, not because they wanted to mock him. He took a deep, shaky breath. He wasn't doing this for them. He was doing it to survive the next 5 minutes. He just hoped he could remember how to make his fingers move. He lifted his hands. They looked old and worn against the pristine black and white keys. He hovered there for a moment, the tension in the room pulling tight like a rubber band. The host leaned in, waiting for the first clumsy mistake. Then, with a sudden, sharp movement, he brought his hands down. The sound that exploded from the instrument wasn't the clumsy, hesitant plink-plunk that everyone was expecting. It was a crash, a deep and thunderous boom that seemed to shake the floorboards beneath their feet. It was like a sudden storm had burst through the ceiling of the penthouse. The vibration rattled the empty champagne glasses sitting on the piano's lid, sending a hum through the entire room that you could feel in your chest. The laughter died instantly. It happened so fast it was like someone had cut a wire. The guests who had been smirking, holding their drinks ready to toast his failure, froze with their mouths half open. The sound was too big, too rich, and too perfect to be a mistake. The initial chord hung in the air, echoing off the glass walls, demanding respect. For the old waiter, the moment his fingers made contact with the keys, something in his brain clicked. It was like lighting a match in a dark room. For years, he had carried heavy trays, scrubbed floors, and walked with his head down to hide his face from the world. But his hands remembered. His fingers were rough, the skin was thick from hard labor, and the joints were stiff, but the muscles remembered exactly what to do. They woke up. He didn't have time to think. If he stopped to think, he would get scared again. He would remember the mocking faces and the fear of losing his job. So, he didn't think. He just let his hands take over. As the deep sound of the first chord faded, his right hand moved. It was a blur of motion. He struck the keys again, launching into a complex run of notes that tumbled down the scale like a waterfall. The tempo was fast, much faster than the gentle background jazz they were used to hearing at these kinds of parties. It wasn't Chopsticks or Happy Birthday. It was a classical masterpiece, notoriously difficult, known for its speed and its anger. The host took a step back, his eyes widening. He looked at the piano, then at the waiter's back, completely confused. He had set up a joke, expecting the man to fumble and blush, giving the crowd a reason to laugh. Instead, he was the one who looked foolish. He waited for the sour note, the fumble, the moment where the music would fall apart. But it didn't come. The notes were sharp and clear, cutting through the thick air of the room like a knife. Near the bar, a young woman put her phone down. She had been ready to record a funny video to post online, but now she forgot all about it. Her brow furrowed as she watched the man's posture. He wasn't hunched over the keys like an amateur struggling to see the notes. He was sitting up straight, his shoulders back, his body swaying slightly with the rhythm. His hands were moving with a speed that seemed impossible for someone his age, especially someone whose hands were supposed to be ruined by work. The music wasn't just noise, it was a story. It started dark and heavy, full of the sadness and frustration he had swallowed for years. It sounded like a caged animal finally breaking free. Then, the melody began to rise, weaving in and out, jumping from the low, growling bass to the high, singing treble. It was aggressive, yet incredibly beautiful. The wait staff in the corner stopped polishing glasses. The security guards at the door, who usually looked straight ahead, turned their heads to stare. Even the chefs in the kitchen, peeking through the swinging doors, paused what they were doing to listen. The entire energy of the party had shifted. The arrogance that had filled the room was being replaced by something else, awe. He wasn't playing for the CEO anymore. He wasn't playing to keep his job. In his mind, he wasn't in a penthouse in Manhattan. He had closed his eyes and blocked out the chandeliers and the expensive tuxedos. In his mind, he was back in a small, dusty room years ago, playing for the pure love of it. He could feel the vibrations of the strings traveling up his arms, shaking the tension out of his shoulders. The sticky keys didn't matter anymore. The dirty napkins on the lid didn't matter. Suddenly, the music changed gears. It became even more complex, a dizzying blur of notes that required both hands to fly across the keyboard independently. The left hand was pounding out a heavy, driving rhythm while the right hand danced over the top in a swirl of intricate melodies. It was the kind of music that usually takes two people to play, or a lifetime to master. The guests began to realize that this wasn't a trick. This wasn't a joke. The man in the worn-out vest was a master. A hush fell over the crowd that was so deep you could hear the traffic outside the windows, far below. People started putting down their drinks. They stopped checking their watches. They stopped looking at each other and just looked at him. They stopped seeing the uniform and started seeing the artist. One of the investors, a man who usually boasted about owning rare instruments and knowing everything about music, whispered to his neighbor, "Do you know what piece that is?" The neighbor shook his head, unable to take his eyes off the waiter's flying fingers. "I think it's composer's style, but nobody plays it like that anymore. It's too hard. It's technically impossible for most players." The waiter could feel the sweat dripping down his temples, but he didn't wipe it away. He was breathing hard, his chest heaving with the physical effort of playing at such intensity, but he felt more alive than he had in 20 years. The music was pouring out of him, releasing all the frustration of the evening, the years of being invisible, the pain of his lost career. Every note was a shout. Every chord was a statement. I am here. I am not what you think I am. He hit a section of the song where the rhythm became frantic and intense, the notes cascading like rain hitting a tin roof. His hands were a blur, striking the keys with a force that bordered on violent, yet it remained beautifully controlled. The sound filled every corner of the huge space, drowning out the city noises, drowning out the guests, drowning out the host. The CEO stood frozen by the pillar, his drink forgotten in his hand. He looked small. The power in the room had shifted completely. It was no longer in the hands of the man with the money, it was in the hands of the man at the piano. The waiter had gone from being the joke of the party to being the most powerful person in the room, simply by touching the keys. As he approached the climax of the first movement, the waiter's face changed completely. The fear was gone. The look of resignation had vanished. His eyes were closed, his head tilted slightly back, lost completely in the storm of his own creation. The room was holding its breath, captured by the magic of the moment, terrified to make a sound and break the spell. He was just getting started. The silence that followed the first explosive flurry of notes was different from the quiet that had filled the room before. It wasn't an empty silence, it was a heavy, waiting silence. The man at the piano didn't let it last long. His hand slowed down, just for a second, before diving into a melody that was heartbreakingly beautiful. The thunder turned into a gentle rain. He wasn't just playing a song anymore, he was pouring his life out into the room. Every note seemed to carry a memory, a regret, or a dream that he had kept locked away for decades. The music flowed like a river, sometimes calm and smooth, and sometimes crashing against the rocks. The transition from the aggressive, fast-paced introduction to this deep, soulful melody was so seamless that the guests didn't realize they were holding their breath until their lungs started to burn. The people near the piano stopped looking at their phones. A young woman who had been giggling with her friends only minutes ago now stood perfectly still, her eyes fixed on the man's back. She wasn't seeing a waiter in a cheap vest anymore. She was seeing a human being bearing his soul. The cynical look on her face melted away, replaced by a look of wonder. It's amazing how art can do that. It strips away the clothes, the money, and the social status, leaving only the raw emotion underneath. Near the bar, the man who had mocked the waiter earlier stood with his mouth slightly open. He took a sip of his drink, then forgot to swallow as the music swelled. He looked at his own friends, hoping someone would make a joke to break the tension, but no one did. They were all captivated. The arrogance had drained out of the room, replaced by a strange kind of reverence. They realized they were witnessing something rare, something that money couldn't buy. You can rent a hall, you can buy expensive champagne, and you can hire the best chefs, but you cannot buy true genius. The CEO, the host of the party, was leaning against a pillar, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. His face was a mask of confusion. He had expected a train wreck. He had set up this situation to feel powerful, to remind everyone that he was in control of the room. But now, the control was gone. He watched as the waiters and serving staff, who usually stayed in the shadows, crept closer to the entrance of the main hall to listen. They were proud. They were looking at one of their own, a man who usually served them drinks, now commanding the attention of the most powerful people in the city. The CEO felt a strange sensation in his gut. It felt like jealousy, mixed with a heavy dose of embarrassment. The music shifted again. It became complex and intricate, weaving two different melodies together that seemed to be having a conversation. The man's left hand was keeping a steady, grounding rhythm, while his right hand danced wildly on the higher keys. It was a conversation between a man who had to work hard to survive and the dreams he still carried in his heart. The physical effort was visible now, sweat was soaking through the back of his black vest. His shoulders were moving with the music, swaying like a tree in the wind. He didn't look like an old, tired servant anymore. His posture was straight, his head held high. In the reflection of the darkened window, he caught a glimpse of himself. For the first time in years, he recognized the person looking back. He wasn't just a server. He was a musician. The magic of the piano was that it gave him back his identity. For the duration of the song, he wasn't defined by his uniform or his bank account. He was defined by the beauty he was creating. The sound was so rich that it seemed to vibrate against the guest's chest bones. It was a physical experience, not just an auditory one. A man in a gray suit, who looked like he hadn't smiled in years, suddenly closed his eyes. A tear escaped and rolled down his cheek. He didn't wipe it away. The music was touching something buried deep inside him, maybe a memory of his own childhood, or a regret about a path he didn't take. That was the power of the performance. It wasn't just about the waiter, it was a mirror for everyone listening. It forced them to look at their own lives, their own arrogance, and their own forgotten passions. The tempo began to pick up again. The gentle, sad melody started to climb, getting faster and louder, building toward a peak. The guests felt their heart rates rising in sync with the rhythm. The waiter's feet found the pedals, and he used them to deepen the sound, making the piano roar like a lion. The noise filled the massive space, drowning out the city noise below, drowning out the clinking of glasses, and drowning out the superficial chatter of the wealthy. The host watched the hands of the people around him. They weren't checking their watches anymore. They weren't looking for the next opportunity to network. They were completely focused. He realized, with a sinking feeling, that he had completely lost control of the narrative. He tried to step forward, to reclaim the center of attention, but his feet felt like they were made of lead. He couldn't interrupt this. It would be like trying to stop a tidal wave with a teaspoon. As the music reached its climax, the man's hands were a blur of motion. It looked impossible. The sounds coming from the instrument were so complex and layered that it sounded like 2 or 3 people were playing at once. The notes were cascading down, rushing toward a final, dramatic conclusion. The room was electric. The air hummed with anticipation. In that moment, the social barriers that separated the haves from the have-nots completely dissolved. There was no CEO and no waiter. There was no rich and no poor. There was just the music. It was a great equalizer. The guests were seeing the man, not the uniform. And for the first time that night, the man wasn't invisible. He was the most visible person in the world. He poured every ounce of his remaining energy into the keys, his body arching forward, driving the sound to its absolute limit. The pain in his fingers was gone, replaced by a pure, white-hot light of inspiration. He was riding the wave of the melody, and he wasn't going to let go until he crashed onto the shore. The guests leaned in unconsciously, drawn toward the piano like moths to a flame. They knew it was coming to an end, and strangely, none of them wanted it to stop. The party they had come for was boring and fake. This moment was real. This moment was alive. And as the man raised his hands high for the final, thunderous chords, the CEO finally understood his mistake. He hadn't hired a servant to play a joke. He had awakened a giant. And he was no longer the one holding the power. The final chord seemed to hang in the air forever, vibrating through the floorboards, the furniture, and even the bones of the people listening. It was a massive, triumphant sound that felt like a door slamming shut on the past. The man's hands stayed pressed against the keys, letting the last of the sound bleed out into the silence of the room. His chest was heaving, his shirt clinging to his back with sweat, but for the first time all night, he felt light. He felt free. He pulled his hands back and placed them gently on his lap. He didn't turn around immediately. He just sat there, staring at the keys that had set him free. The room was completely, utterly silent. It wasn't the polite silence you give when someone stops talking, it was a heavy, shocked silence. No one knew what to do. They had come expecting a joke, and they had just witnessed a miracle. The arrogance that had filled the room like a thick fog had vanished completely. It started with just one person. An older man standing near the back, someone who had been quiet all night, slowly raised his hands and began to clap. It was a steady, rhythmic clap. Then, a woman joined in. Within seconds, the silence broke. The applause didn't just build, it exploded. It started as a ripple and turned into a roar. People weren't just clapping out of politeness, they were clapping because they were moved, because they were thrilled, and because they knew they had seen something they would never see again. The guests began to stand up. One by one, then in groups, until the entire room was on its feet. The sound was deafening, filling the high ceilings with appreciation. Whistles and shouts of bravo mixed with the clapping. The young man who had mocked the waiter earlier was standing still, his hands hanging by his sides, his face pale. He wasn't clapping, but he wasn't laughing anymore. He looked like a child who had just been scolded by life itself. The waiter finally turned around on the bench. He looked out at the sea of faces. For years, he had looked at these people as a servant looks at masters. He saw their shoes first, then their expensive clothes, and rarely their eyes. But now, he looked them in the eye. He saw admiration. He saw shock. He saw respect. It was a strange feeling, almost overwhelming, but he didn't let it go to his head. He knew who he was. He wasn't a rock star, he was just a man who had kept a fire burning inside him for a long time. The CEO, the host of the party, pushed his way through the crowd. His face was a mix of emotions: embarrassment that he had been wrong, but also excitement. He loved owning valuable things, and he realized that a valuable thing had been sitting in his servant's quarters. He reached the piano, breathing hard, his expensive tie slightly loosened. He held up his hands to quiet the crowd, and the applause slowly died down. "That was incredible," the CEO said, his voice loud and projecting. "I had no idea. I really didn't. You are a true master." He paused, looking around at his guests to make sure they were seeing his generosity. "I want to hire you. Right now. How much do you make a night? Double it? No, triple it? I want you to play at my corporate retreat next month. I'll pay you more than you've ever made in your life. We can sign a contract tonight." The CEO pulled a checkbook from his pocket, waving it in the air like a flag. He expected the man to be grateful. He expected him to say thank you, to bow down, and to accept the charity that money could buy. He thought he could purchase the magic he had just heard. The waiter looked at the checkbook, then up at the CEO's face. He smiled, but it wasn't a desperate smile. It was the smile of a man who has nothing left to prove. He slowly stood up from the bench and adjusted his vest, smoothing out the wrinkles. "I appreciate the offer, sir," the waiter said, his voice steady and calm. "But I can't accept it." The crowd gasped. The CEO froze, his pen hovering over the checkbook. What do you mean? Do you want more money? Name your price." "It's not about the money," the waiter said softly. "I played tonight because I had to. Because the music was inside me and it needed to come out. But I'm not for sale. Not anymore." The CEO looked confused, and a little angry. "But you're a waiter. You could be famous. You could be rich. The waiter looked at the grand piano one last time, running his hand affectionately over the dusty lid. Music isn't about being rich. It's about being honest. And honestly, I played for kings and queens in the past. Tonight, I played because I wanted to, not because I was paid to. That makes it worth more than any check you can write. He turned to leave, but then he paused and looked back at the CEO. There was no arrogance in his voice, just a simple truth. One more thing, sir. This piano is a masterpiece. It deserves to be treated like one. Please, next time, don't use it for drinks. Get a table. He didn't wait for a response. He didn't wait for the CEO to recover from the shock or for the guests to nod in agreement. He simply walked past the stunned host, heading back toward the service station. He picked up his silver tray from the side table where he had left it. He wiped the edge with a white cloth, gave a small nod to the other waiters who were grinning at him with wide eyes, and headed for the kitchen doors. As the doors swung shut behind him, cutting off the noise of the party, he felt a sense of peace settle over him. He went back to work. He cleared dirty glasses, he wiped down tables, and he took orders. The guests who came back into the room treated him differently now. They stepped aside to let him pass. They whispered as he went by. They saw him differently, but he didn't care. He knew he wasn't just a waiter. He was a musician. And now, for the first time in a long time, he knew that everyone else knew it too. He walked through the rest of the shift with a lightness in his step, whistling a quiet melody under his breath, knowing that while he might not have the CEO's money, he had something far more valuable. He had his dignity, and he had his music. And no amount of mocking could ever take that away from him again.